Hello everybody, thank you for watching my video and don't forget to hit like, subscribe and comment. One of Charles's main priorities when he became sole king was to finally bring a conclusion to the Frankish war with the Aquitanians that had been begun by Charles's father, Pepin. Charles seemed to think that the war could be brought to a quick resolution and Aquitaine thereby brought under control. But this thought process proved to be optimistic and erroneous. For one, much of Pepin's reign had been dominated by this conflict and had not been resolved by the time the old king died. So quite why Charles thought it would be any different during his rule is unclear, and soon enough he too found the situation to be a difficult one. Charles had begun the expedition into Aquitaine whilst his brother and co-king Charlemagne was still alive. Charles, realising the potential difficulty of subduing the duchy, requested help from Charlemagne, but his brother flatly refused. Charles, despite the problems now hitting his Aquitanian campaign, refused to withdraw, and he persisted until eventually he succeeded in capturing the duchy. After its last duke died, Aquitaine was then occupied by another claimant named Honold, who was quite prepared to renew hostilities with Charles and the Franks. But Charles soon had him on the run. Honold fled into Gascony. Charles did not want to allow him to gather himself and make another invasion of Aquitaine, and so Charles went in pursuit of him. Charles demanded that Duke Lupus of Gascony surrendered Honold immediately or otherwise face the wrath of Charles and his army. Lupus did not need telling twice. Not only did he hand over Honold to him, but he also paid homage to the king of the Franks. Charles's reputation as a king to be reckoned with was starting to grow. But there was no rest for the wicked. Once Aquitaine had been fully subdued, Charles then restarted another of his father's wars, this time with the Lombards. Pepin had had some difficulty with the Lombards and had been compelled on 2 occasions to invade Italy. Pepin's invasions had come at the request of the Pope, as the Lombards had infringed on Roman territory. Pepin's control over Italy, though, was evidently rather fragile. Charles, though, was far more forceful. He ground down the Lombard king, a man called Desiderius, with a relentless siege. And then he turned his attentions towards the king's son, called Adalgis. Charles not only drove Adalgis out of Lombardy, but out of Italy altogether. He restored to the Romans all territories that had been wrongfully taken from them. Then, when the Duke of Friuli went into open rebellion against him, Charles crushed him swiftly. Much of Italy was now under his control. Charles's kingdom was now slowly turning into an empire. But matters were not all plain sailing for Charles, and indeed his most enduring problem would lay with the Saxons. His wars with them would drag on for decades. Charles's chronicler, Einhard, is not flattering in his descriptions of the Saxons. He accuses them of using any little excuse to incite war with the Franks. He criticizes their pagan practices and accuses them of carrying out regular atrocities. Murder, robbery, and arson were frequent, as the Saxons infringed on Frankish lands. It's safe to say, though, that both sides would have been guilty of such charges. War was declared on the Saxons. Einhard states that this could have been avoided if the Saxons had checked their behaviour. But irregardless of this, this particular war feels wholly unnecessary and was certainly not one that needed to be dragged out for over 3 decades. Both sides suffered, although the Saxons sustained heavier losses. The Franks frequently beat their foes in battle and took hostages as a surety of good behaviour, but this seemed to make little difference to the Saxons, who kept coming back for more. Charles himself must have become exasperated as the whole affair dragged on, and he himself didn't even engage with the Saxons frequently. Charlemagne only met them in battle on 4 occasions between 775 and 783. On those occasions, the Frankish king inflicted heavy losses on the Saxons and repelled them for a time, but still the Saxon Wars would continue into the early 9th century. Leaving others to take charge of the Saxon campaigns, Charles gathered an army and headed towards the Pyrenees, where he captured towns and castles. This campaign was a success up until the moment Charles and his men decided to return home. While still in the mountains, they were ambushed by a Basque force. Charles and the main part of his army had marched on ahead of the supporting army that was designed to protect them from behind. The rear of the army was some way behind and vulnerable to an ambush in territory where thick forest meant enemies could hide themselves easily and prepare to attack. When the moment was right, the Basques came pouring down the mountainside and attacked the baggage train. Charles's men were forced down into a valley below where a general massacre took place, and the Basques seized all they could before escaping into the cover of the forests. This is known as the Battle of Rendezvous in 778, though it's not really so much a battle as it is an opportunistic attack. The ease with which the Basques managed to escape, coupled with the burden of heavy armour and equipment of the Franks, meant any possible immediate retort was almost impossible. In 786, Charles ordered a military campaign against the Bretons, which was initially successful, but wouldn't last. The Bretons would give Charles trouble on and off for an extended period of time. They would pay him homage in the year 800, the year he became Holy Roman Emperor, but they would again go into open revolt. As had been the case with the Saxons, hostages were taken by the Franks in an effort to ensure the Bretons behaved, but again the tactic would not work especially well. That same year, Charles led another military campaign into Italy. This time the issue was in Benevento, where the Duke was a man who was not made of the sternest stuff. Fearing the king of the Franks' approach, the Duke sent 2 of his sons to meet Charles, and urged him to take the 2 young boys as hostages if he agreed not to come to Benevento. The Duke had completely thrown his own sons under the bus, due to his cowardice and refusal to meet Charles in person. He swore his realm would obey Charles's orders if he agreed to these terms. Charles kept the youngest son hostage and returned the eldest back to his father. Unsurprisingly, Charles wanted more formal signs of loyalty, and apparently content when he got them, he spent some time in Rome, and the situation in Benevento calmed down. As you can probably tell, 8th century Europe was a turbulent place, and Charles had more trouble to deal with in the following year of 787. This time, it came from the east in Bavaria. The Duke there, a man named Tassilo, was married to the daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius. The daughter perhaps wanted to gain revenge on Charles on behalf of her father and exiled brother. She urged her husband to make an alliance with the Huns. This could cause Charles's kingdom all kinds of trouble, and Tassilo and his wife then began to completely ignore any of Charles's commands. Provoked into a reaction, Charles responded by marching on Bavaria. Tassilo capitulated in weak fashion when he saw that, if he pursued aggression against the king any further, then he would bring on not only his own destruction, but those of his people. He came to the king in person to ask for forgiveness. By this point, Charles seems to have been agitated at the number of uprisings he was having to deal with, and he was not as forgiving as he might have been. He refused to let Tassilo return home, and instead ordered the Duke to become a monk. Charles then launched a campaign against the Slavs. Supposedly on his side during this particular campaign were his erstwhile foes, the Saxons, but their loyalty was very questionable indeed. The reason for this particular campaign was that the Slavs had been causing problems for a group of people allied to the Franks called the Abradrites. This campaign was brought to a swift conclusion in 789, and the Slavs were crushed. Charles himself had led the expedition, and the Slavs were now brought completely back under his control. Potentially the far biggest threat posed to Charles and his territories came in the shape of the Huns, and it was not a threat that Charles or his men took lightly either, and the wars with the Huns stretched on for over a decade. Charles led an expedition against them into Pannonia before entrusting his son Pepin to lead the attack. It was a bitterly fought war in which the Franks fought determinedly, and eventually their efforts were rewarded in spectacular fashion. The Huns had been a menace to Europe for centuries, and over time had accumulated tremendous wealth. This perhaps explains the Franks' determination to continue a long and difficult war. After a series of long and arduous battles, the Franks began to inflict heavy defeats on the Huns. Soon, most of the leading figures in the Huns' army were wiped out, with the Franks sustaining an almost negligible number of losses to their own nobility. Along with these great military victories came great wealth, and the Franks seized all the riches that the Huns had stockpiled from their earlier exploits. It's said that the Franks had never seen such wealth. Charles, after he had become emperor in 800, also had trouble with the Danes between 804 and 810, and their king even threatened to attack Charles's imperial capital at Aachen. This king, named Godfried, was murdered, however, and so his attack never came to pass.